we've been making wines in Lebanon for around 5,000 to 6,000 years.
Give or take.
Give or take. Because we don't count, we count in thousands, yes, exactly. In Lebanon, I mean, the history of the country obviously is old. There have been people living there, and actually the birthplace of wine is not the Middle East, it's Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is current Iraq, Iran, Georgia, Armenia, so it's a bit more north of where we are. And that's probably 7,000 years ago. There are obviously different people with different numbers, but this is roughly the ballpark, within 1,000 years, as you said. And then wine made its way through to the Middle East around 6,000 years ago. Our ancestors in Mount Lebanon, in what is now Mount Lebanon as an area, used to produce wines. Our ancestors were the Canaanians and then eventually the Phoenicians. And we're talking roughly 4,000, 4,500 years ago to 2,500 roughly. It's a phase which was fairly long, and the Phoenicians used to be extremely important for wine because they brought in wine from Mesopotamia, started producing it in good quantities and in also good quality, but most importantly, they started selling it. And the Phoenicians had boats. They used to have a trade of cedar wood across the Mediterranean. They used to sell to the pharaohs, to the eventually to what would become Greece, etc. And they would sell initially cedar wood. They sold purple dye. Purple dye was the first dye that was actually a permanent dye, created or harvested from seashells. It's the blood of seashells that existed in the area, and that allowed to create. When you imagine a Roman wearing a purple or dark red robe, this is the color that you would get, and it's the first dye that was permanent, so you didn't have to re-dye all the time. So they would trade that. If you were trading the dye that was dark red, you thought, okay, why not trade wine? It's almost the same color. It actually, it probably leads to it probably led them to trade all the wines, and so wines gradually made their way westwards. And so some of the vines that we have still in Lebanon, and that when you will taste all the whites, Chateau Musar whites, are probably vines and varietals that existed in Lebanon at the time. So when you're tasting this, you're tasting really wines that were present, although they were probably prepared in a different way, because conservation at the time was not not easy, avoiding oxidation, etc. So that's, let's say, 3,000-4,000 years ago. Fast forward a few thousand years, actually a couple of thousand years, you get to 2,000 years ago. So we're in the era where Romans used to control all of the Mediterranean. They had the ability, they used to worship gods, different gods, for different types of gods. And one of them was Bacchus, god of wine. And they could build temples wherever they wanted, because they had all the control of all the Mediterranean. And they decided to build one particular temple for Bacchus, god of wine, in Broadbent. Broadbent is in the Beeman, the sister company now that I know of Toledo, one of the sister companies of Toledo. So why did they build it there? Because of the history. 2,000 years ago, they thought, okay, there's already a couple of thousand years of history of winemaking in the area, so if we're going to build a temple for Bacchus, it has to be there. Probably because of Islam. Lebanon became part of the Turkish Empire, of the Ottoman Empire, and wine production gradually stopped. And this is where France, Italy, Spain picked up the ball and continued producing wine. So today, when we talk about old world wines, we talk about Italy, France, and Spain, because of the contribution that they've had in the last 1,500 years. But so, where do you put Lebanon? Which category? We are not old world because it's Italy, France, and Spain. Are we new world? Would you put us in new world category? I don't think we should be in the New World category. Also because of the style of our wines. The style of our wines is not New World. But also we've been producing wines for 6,000 years. So I have a new term that we've introduced, and you should remember, which is ancient world. And so if you have to think of Lebanon, and all of the region, Mesopotamia included, so Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, think of ancient world, because that is really what Lebanon is about. So we get to, let's say, 1850s, where monks started producing wines in Lebanon. Usually you realize that most of the alcoholic beverages are produced by monks. You know, wine, beer, you know, a lot of the of typical things. And they're the ones who really started again the production. And then I move on to a bit more history, and sorry if it's a bit long, but it's really to give you the context, because you know then you'll understand when you taste some of the wines why we have certain choices, why we have certain varieties in our wines. And so the Turkish Empire, they were with the Germans, lost World War I. So in 1920, the French and the British decided to determine the borders of what are the current countries in the Middle East. So Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine at the time, because this is, we're talking 1920. And so the British and the French determined all these borders. The French helped set up the government in France, Syria, and North, and the British took all the countries south. And so the French were posted in Lebanon. And my grandfather, in the 1920s, went to France to study actually medicine, nothing to do with wine. Didn't like it, just spent 1 year. I think he drank more than he actually studied, because he came back with an idea, and which was, okay, he started a winery, which was Musar, initially to cater to the French army that was posted in Lebanon. He became the first, the only supplier for all the officers' mass across the Levant area, so all of the Middle East. And this is how Musar started. When I spoke to my father at the time and my uncle, they tell me that at the time, even in Bordeaux, people were not bottling wine. They used to sell it in bottle. But my grandfather thought, no, we're going to really set the level very high, so in terms of quality of what we produce, but also bottling. So we were probably one of the first ones to bottle, even before some of the bigger Bordeaux wines, to bottle and sell as a bottle. So that's the 1930s. And then my father took over in 59. If you think of 50s and 60s, this is the time where the chemistry of wine was being discovered. People were starting to understand what is happening really in the wine. What is the fermentation? What is the initial first fermentation? Then the malolactic fermentation. What is really happening? And human nature is, as soon as you understand something, and you figure out how it works, what do you want to do? You want to change it. You want to control it. Right? This is really human nature. And so, there was a big shift that was starting to happen in France, in particular, because this was the main driver, I guess, of finding new technologies to control more wine. If something was missing, they would add something. If something was too much, they would subtract it. Today, you have wines that are made with membranes. You take a wine, you add lots of things, and then you decide through a membrane, and then you can strip things out to get to the taste that you want. I call that makeup wine, basically. And the whole approach of my father, when he decided to take over, was to say, we're not going to embrace all of that new modern technology that's coming into wine. We're going to make our wines natural. Nothing. No makeup. No filtering. Natural fermentation. Organic vineyards. No fining. No additives. Nothing. Really nothing. Even at the beginning, there was no sulfur in our wines. Now we add a little bit of sulfur. I mean, it's been 20 years. because we sell it now everywhere in the world. And so you want to make sure that the wines are going to withstand transport. Because transport affects, obviously, wines. And so with a bit of sulfur, you avoid a deterioration of the wines. But that is the only thing that we do. And so that approach is really what my father brought to Musar in terms of the philosophy of being what I call non-interventionist, and also the approach of then eventually creating the blend that you will taste when you taste the Chateau Musar Blanc. The blend of the Chateau label, which is what we're known for, is really the brainchild of my father. And now my cousin, my brother and myself are third generation running the business. Okay. This is the sea. It's blue, it's the Mediterranean. You have Egypt, and this is sort of, we're on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. You have Egypt here, Israel, Lebanon, which is actually a rectangle along the coastline. So this is the green part, really perfect. Syria, and to our east and north, and then Turkey. So imagine the green part is Lebanon. You have 120 miles of coastline, and on average 30 miles wide. I repeat, 120 miles long, 30 miles wide. So it's
With a mountain in the middle.
tiny, with two mountains. Actually, there's one chain of mountains on the border with Syria, which is called Anti-Lebanon, Mount Anti-Lebanon, and one chain of mountains in the middle that is called Mount Lebanon. Now, I don't know why they called it Mount Anti-Lebanon. I don't know if there was a subliminal message in what was happening, but anyway, this is how it's called. These two chains of mountains go up to 10,000 feet. So fairly high. And between these two chains, so you have these two chains here, you have the Bekaa Valley. The Bekaa Valley is at 3,000 feet of altitude. So it's nestled between one chain of mountains that protects it from the sea, of the humidity, and another chain of mountains that protects it from the heat from the desert. So it's a microclimate, very specific to the region, to that valley. I would almost call it continental as a climate. And because we have so much altitude, you have to think of Lebanon as green, not dry. So there's no desert, no camels. It's really a different set of, you have to imagine Lebanon as mountains, snow, skiing in the winter, from Beirut, which is here, middle of the, to go up to skiing, which is here, 45 minutes if there's no traffic. So you wake up in the morning, you open up, there's white covered mountains, you just go out skiing. This is what we used to do when I was. And so this Bekaa Valley has altitude, which allows us really to plant and get wines that are elegant. Because if you take a line and go this way, you'll reach the top of Morocco. So we are below Sicily, below Crete, below obviously all of Italy, and even below the bottom of Spain. So if you're so much south, you would expect that with the heat, you would get heavier wines, a lot more alcohol, a lot more ripeness, and not too much elegance. But because we have altitude, it allows to compensate for that southernness that we have.
You have to irrigate?
We don't irrigate. We could, but we don't. Other wineries do, we don't. Mount Lebanon, and actually on that mountain, initially most of the vines were planted, because at the time it was mostly white. But then as people started planting reds, I believe that, and vegetables and fruits and wheat, all of that started to be planted in the Bekaa Valley because it's easier, it's flat. Otherwise, in Lebanon you have a lot of terraces, but it's a lot of work. And the reason people built all these terraces in Lebanon was that Lebanon was always invaded by everyone, anybody and everybody. And sometimes they got so comfortable that This is when they started to either integrate into the society and then stay, or eventually get kicked out by somebody else. But the Mount Lebanon, because it's so steep and so high, was very difficult to conquer. So the invaders would come through the coastline, through the Bekaa Valley, but not on the mountains. And in particular, the Christians have always stayed in these mountains to protect themselves. Not only the Christians, but those who were effectively protecting themselves from invaders. So they had to do all these terraces just to survive, because they could not plant anywhere else. As peace started to settle, the Bekaa Valley, which is today the most viable area to plant, is where we have most of the vines now. Now, again, if I look at my graph, I should buy this painting now. So Beirut is here, middle of the country. The winery is here, on the coastline. The vineyards are in the Bekaa Valley, a 3-hour truck drive. So why? Again, history. When Lebanon was created in 1920, it was a collection of different areas with different religions. Areas which were more Christian, areas which were more Shiite, Sunnite, Druze, and so it was a bit of a patchwork. And my grandfather wasn't sure that this whole thing would survive, so he had a good instinct. And he had a cousin of his who had a palace, which was a 400-year-old palace called the Musar Palace, MZAR, in Razia, so just north of Beirut. And so he decided to start the winery there, but plant in the Bekaa Valley. And so this is why today we have a 3-hour truck drive. And the way we bring the grapes to the winery is in big trucks, where we just put all of the grapes, and we take them for a stroll in the sun at 32 degrees for 3 hours. So, for those of you who've done a bit of winemaking or enology classes of winemaking, if you go to your class of winemaking in France or Italy, wherever, and you tell your teacher, I'm going to take my grapes at 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning and drive them for 3 hours in the sun before they reach the winery, you probably not make your test. I mean, you won't get your grades. But this is how we do it, and it is part of history. And this is where history is important for us: is that it has determined a lot of things that impact eventually our wines. So, our whole approach is non-interventionist. I don't want any makeup on our wine. So, why do we use wood? We use wood initially just so that the wine gets accustomed to a bit of airing. Because once it's going to be in a bottle, there's always a bit of air that goes through the cork. So the passage in wood is like a vaccination, almost. But we don't want to add any flavor. So what do? We use old wood. Typically, we only use actually 10% new woods every year. And over 10 years, we would have changed all of our barrels. The wood that we use is from France, so that it does not have the vanilla aspect of American oak. In France, you have less of this vanilla flavor that comes out, and we don't even toast it, because when you build your barrel, you need to burn it a bit just to bend the wood. But once you bend it, some people also then really burn the inside of the wood. So what does it do? It tends to lead to obviously more smokiness, but also extraction of the tannins of the wood are much faster. But we don't want that, so we basically do not toast the wood. And so it gives the least possible impact in terms of wood impact on the wine. Why? Because I don't want wood wine. I want wine. So when you're tasting wood, what you're tasting is it's a wine that is a bit more complex. Now everybody tastes different, and it's all then a question of habit as to what you're tasting. But it's a wine that's also older. So you're not on fresh fruit anymore. You're starting to move away from fresh fruit to something, either dried fruit, probably would be the best comparison, or stewed fruit, cooked fruit. So last weekend we were in Alice Beach in Florida, and we had a group of sommeliers from around the country who came. And we did 2 tastings, one whites, only whites, and one only reds. Check the time. The reds, we went from 09 to 64. The reputation of Musar was built on the ability of our wines to age and the elegance. So we double decanted and tasted all the wines actually blind, because we were going to do 2 tastings. So to keep it interesting, I poured everything blind to all the songs, 11 wines of red. And so we did that in the morning, tasted through the wines for 2.5 hours. And then at the end, we had like a bit of wine left. We went to the beach and had dinner, and then came back around midnight. And then we retasted all the wines after 14 hours. And for me, the wines that had really opened up the most and that were showing the best after 14 hours were 64 and 72. After 14 hours. Yeah. I mean, I meet some sommeliers who tell me, if you're going to open 66, a vintage of 66, they don't know Musar. They tell me, you open it 5 minutes before, and then you pour it, and you don't decant it, because after 10 minutes, according to them, all the wines will die. You don't really shut down. You have an aroma for 10 minutes, after 10 minutes the wines are dead. In Musar, it's exactly the opposite. You open and you decant and you leave it as much as you can, and it will only get better. Now, why does it apply to our wines? I don't know. We always had Cabernet, Cinsault, and Carignan, maybe in different percentages. And I think at the time of my grandfather, we had Petit Verdot and one more variety, I can't remember anymore. But gradually my father in the 60s narrowed it down, and then set the percentages and the methodology of how we make the wines. So here, the way we make the wines is that we harvest every plot of land separate and every varietal separate. We keep them in cement vats for 1 year. Cement, why cement? Because it's the most neutral container for us, has the least impact on taste. Then it goes through wood for 1 year. Again, not new wood, only 10% new wood, not toasted. And then we blend at the end of year 2. So we have 15, 20 vats, whatever number, and then we blend them according to basically what we think is the signature of Musar. Then it goes back into cement vats for 1 year, so that the wine settles as one. This is where also it builds up complexity. And then at the end of year 3, we bottle, and then we leave it in our cellars for 4 or 5 years before we sell it. So we have a lot of wine. A lot of wine. And this is typical of Musar. If you go older, as the wine becomes more complex, it's very difficult to go back to a younger wine. Because the older wine has much more to say, much more to offer. And the younger wines appear almost simple after an old wine. But a younger wine on its own is great. So it's just a question of comparison and how you've spoiled yourself by getting the 98 or 01 vintage on the palate and then having to go back to something which is not as sophisticated when it's young. Okay. These 2 varietals probably are the ones that exist, or part of the ones that existed at the time. Because they only exist today in Lebanon. So they would not have come from anywhere else. So they are rooted. And I'll tell you to which point. I mean, when we harvest Viognier, Vermentino, and Chardonnay in August, they are at 14 degrees alcohol, 13 and a half. Then we harvest the reds in September, 14 degrees alcohol. Then we harvest Obeida and Merwa, these 2 local varieties, 12 degrees alcohol in October. So it's their nature. They are very well adapted to the terroir. They know how to deal with the heat and with the sun. It's just that when they arrive, because they've been so long in the sun, they are almost baked, they are almost brownish, but not shriveled. Just a thick skin from tanning. They like tanning. But they only give us 12 degrees of alcohol. So the intensity that you taste is not the alcohol level. It's just the type of the grape, the fact that there's a long ripening, and they're very low yields. So The grapes in here, so we have two local varietals that only exist in Lebanon. So these are probably the varietals that I think existed at the time, like 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Obeide. Obeide is a local grape that is similar in style to Chardonnay. O-B-E-I-D-E-H. And the other one is Merwah, which we believe is the ancestor of Semillon. Merwah is M-E-R-W-A-H. Now you asked me a question of DNA earlier. So we haven't done any DNA analysis on Merwah, but we've done ampelography, which is the analysis of the shape of the leaves. So we believe it's an ancestor of Semillon. But we haven't managed to do the DNA. Another producer lately started using Obeide and has made the DNA analysis of Obeide. And according to that result, there's no link to Chardonnay. But in Lebanon, there are many variations of Obeide. So we don't know exactly which variation we sent and whether they're different or not from the ones that we have. They survived phylloxera. These are the only varietals that we have that survived phylloxera. And they are a bit higher than in the mountains than the Bekaa Valley. So maybe that's why they're a bit further away. So because of the distance, maybe it protected them. But today we have to replant a lot of Obeide and Merwah because many of the vines are too old and are starting to die or being uprooted.
How old are these vines?
The oldest we have are 100 plus.
100 plus. Okay.
With yields which are tiny.